Today we are going to be installing some Magura MT7 brakes. There are so many good brakes on the market, these just happen to be my favorite. Their quad piston systems being magnetic, their rotors being extremely strong. We're going to be replacing the stock SRAM DB8 brakes that came on this Rail 7 Gen 2. This is a internal through frame design, so the rear ones will be a little bit tricky. We're going to actually have to cut that. Because the DB8 brakes are actually pretty good, I'm going to go ahead and use them to build up another bike later. So if you're trying to salvage these, then go ahead and pull the brake pads first before cutting the line. Cut it the closest to the fitting that you possibly can to salvage most of the brake line. To accomplish this, we'll be using the Park Tool cable running system, and we'll also be using the Park Tool bleed system, which will have all the fittings for any major brake brand, including bleed blocks, cups, 2 syringes, and even these ones that go on your handlebar to hold the syringes in place if you're trying to do a 2 syringe bleed system, which will show you how to do both. Also includes several hoses with flow stoppers right on them. The cable running kit had a male-to-male fitting that goes right into brake line. And since there's already a brake line through the frame, we'll just use that to guide the new brake line. But we're going to have to go ahead and cut these first. Again, cut it closest to the end of the fitting as you possibly can, and we'll worry about installing a new fitting once the cable is successfully ran through the frame. Again, this is going to be very easy for us because the cable's already ran, and if it wasn't ran, we could just take the battery out because it's an e-bike frame. You can see right in the void and pull the brake line through. For those of you who don't have it this easy, I feel for you. Sorry about that. Anyways, go ahead and install the rear caliper to the frame. That way when you go to size the front brake handle lead, it will be the appropriate size. Leave the yellow block inserts in there for the time being. Then go ahead and cleanly run the rest of the brake line through your frame. The Park Toolkit has a magnetic cable guide that will guide cables through the frame if you don't have an opening like this. Now to reinstall the brake lever to the line. You'll need fittings like these. This is what you had to cut off earlier to remove the old brakes and then reinstall the new brake. Put the stock screw cap back on the line, then push that fitting into the brake line. Then put the coupler over it, and then you're ready to install it. The stock screw fitting pressure fits that coupler onto the brake line. Once it's nice and tight, give it a few test pulls to make sure the line doesn't pull out. It should be ready to take fluid at that point in time. The front brake should already come pre-bled, and you should just be able to install it right to the fork. And hopefully you do not need to add new line to make it longer for whatever reason, and you'd only have to do this to the back brake. But if you have a longer fork or a riser bar, you may have to add new brake line to be longer. That way it fits and flows better with your bike as it turns. There's a star nut at the very top of the brake caliper. Go ahead and remove it, and then attach the syringe. If you only have one syringe, this is how you do a 1 syringe bleed. It uses mineral oil, but only use Magura Royal Purple or you'll void the warranty and who knows how well it will work. Get a syringe full of fluid and bleed out the air before you secure this onto that brake fitting. You need to install the bleed block before you start the bleeding process. In order to do it with 1 syringe, go ahead and pull the syringe so that you're trying to suck fluid out, and you'll end up eventually sucking a bunch of air out. Now, in this process happening, give the air bubbles time to reach the actual syringe. That way it goes up there. Make sure you kind of flick them. You'll get smaller bubbles. They'll take a lot more time to go up the tube. All those bubbles will be replaced with fresh fluid. That way when you go to squeeze back in there, you don't start pushing air bubbles back in. I'm showing you the wrong way, so I can show you the right way. As long as you suck them out and you allow the air bubbles time to reach the syringe, then the air will obviously go to the top over the fluid, and you'll just have nothing but fluid to push back in there. You can flick the line, and that helps the small bubbles that don't seem to want to go up end up going up. A lot of times they'll combine together to make a bigger bubble, and they'll rise faster. Pumping and flicking the brake lever will also help that air get out. You may have to do this several times, especially on a brand new line. You'll know that you're about done once after moving the brake lever several times and you are pulling and pushing through new fluid that you don't pull any new air bubbles out, no matter how small or big. You'll know because when you press, you'll push in clean fluid, and when you pull back out, that's when you're gonna know you're gonna get a little air bubble. So we're getting minute air bubbles now, ever so slightly, and we're just flickering and futtering with the tube until it all cycles in there. When we cycle in there, we pop it in there so it gets back up in this air bubble, you know, the one of the, so it can't go back down. When you think you've got the cleanest run you can, you definitely want to go ahead and give your injector a squeeze. has the max fluid in it. So if you forget that squeeze, then you'll have to do this again. Doing it with one syringe does take a lot of time, but it can be done, and we just did it now. Go ahead and seat the start nut back in there, just hand tight, barely hand tight, like 1 Newton meter of torque is what's required for it, or even less. So it's just plastic. Don't over tighten it, and don't squish the O-ring down. Clean everything up with isopropyl alcohol. Once you are done, and always wear rubber gloves of some sort. Do not let the brake fluid touch your skin. Now for the 2 syringe installation process, which is a whole lot better, and we'll explain why. But first of all, go ahead and install the bleed blocks, otherwise you're never going to get a clean bleed. Go ahead and fill and bleed both syringes with new royal purple fluid, and put the one with the less fluid on the bottom, and the one with the most fluid on the top. And you can go ahead and push on either side. As you push, you will see fluid go from one syringe into the other, and one of those 2 syringes is going to end up getting all the air bubbles, and the syringe itself will just collect them and put them above the fluid. So make sure when you are squeezing fluid in so that you are raising it upside down, that way the air is trapped on top of the fluid, and you can go ahead and push new fluid in. So each time you're doing this, you're collecting air, letting it sit on top of the fluid, and then pushing fresh fluid with no air bubbles back in until there are no air bubbles left. Now you want to flick the lever vigorously, like flick it. Squeeze it, flick it randomly, and that'll just break up any sort of air in the system. You need to run the bleed blocks. You cannot do it without the bleed blocks. You'll never get all the air out. And once you get clean fluid, despite how many times you may flick that lever or squeeze it back or cycle it back, and you are getting no more air, that's when you know it's more or less set. Eventually, you may have a bunch of really small bubbles like this that are so small they have such a hard time rising through the fluid. This is the most frustrating part, and it does take patience, but you need to get all these little small bubbles out because they will eventually compress and form into one big bubble, and you'll have brake failure down the trail. Once you've got as many air bubbles as you think you can possibly get out of the system, go ahead and close the valve. You can do this just by clicking this piece right here on the syringe. Do this to both syringes. That way when you take off one, the other one won't depress or increase fluid, and the other one will also keep the fluid in the tube versus dropping it on the floor. Clean off the caliper thoroughly, all the pistons inside, with alcohol. And make sure it's all dry before you stick the new brake pads or the old brake pads in. After both fluid caps are reinstalled, both on the caliper and the lever, go ahead and squeeze the lever until the brake pads grip the rotor. In a perfect world, they'll detach once you let go of the rotor, and there will be a slim gap between the rotor and all the brake pads that allows the wheel to move freely with no binding. But sometimes this happens where you spin the wheel and you can definitely tell the brakes are still rubbing against the rotor, and there's no way to tune it out because they're too close to the rotor. You have 2 options. Ride it this way until the pads wear in a little bit, and then there'll eventually be the right size gap for your rotor to flow freely. Or, if you're impatient like me, take a small screwdriver and depress the piston back into the caliper while the top star nut on the lever is off. You'll see a tiny little bit of fluid push up. Once you've depressed the pistons, immediately reinstall that star nut snug. Then when the system is completely closed and sealed, go ahead and compress the lever again until it engages on the rotor. But this time when you let go of the lever and you spin the wheel, it should spin freely with no brake drag on the rotor at all. The downside to this method is that the caliper will be weaker than it would be if you just wore the brakes in under tension. But this can be circumvented by getting the strongest grip brake pads and also adjusting the lever. The lever has 2 positions of adjustment. Option 2 is much more critical for people that don't have an e-bike, because you will absolutely feel the brake drag as you're trying to wear those brake pads in, and it can be exhausting. You'll be wasting a bunch more energy, not going near as fast as you could be if the wheels span freely. But on an e-bike, it's much less of an issue because it's obviously power assisted. But even under power, you can still feel the effects of brake drag. This part of using the Magura brakes is the biggest pain about them, but if you can just get past this part, the brakes are phenomenal. Phenomenal grip power. You can use the 200 or the 220 millimeter rotors. I like to run the 220 up front, 200 in the rear. That's a really good balance of power, and I have optimal stopping power. You may notice that after you give your bike a really good workout, like you put some work in on it, and the fluid has had a chance to heat up and compress and recompress as you're using the brakes, that they might get stiff again over your caliper. That means there was still a little bit of air, or all those micro bubbles that you just couldn't get to come up through the syringe now have started to collect together and cause an air pocket in there. So it's not uncommon that after a first ride, you might have to go in there and just do the most minute maintenance bleed of the air out of the system and replace it with some brand new fluid, and then your brakes will just work absolutely phenomenal after that. You shouldn't have any problems once all the air is gone. You won't start seeing any sort of bloating or problems unless the fluid starts to break down. Always remember that changing your fluid in these brakes frequently will kind of keep you polished, and will also, it's just like giving your brakes an oil change. Under heavy speed and pressure, the fluid does break down over time. So just remember that once you've set it, you can't just forget it, especially if you ride hard.
That was fun. On to the next.